That's better. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. Okay, let's get started. Yeah, software is eating the world. Mark Anderson from Netflix famously said that software is eating the world, by which he meant that software is redefining every part of our lives. And he's totally right. Our lives have been transformed massively in almost every aspect, from how we shop to how we handle our finances to how we consume media and entertainment. But actually what sits at the middle of all of that, irrespective of all that content, is the data. So what does that mean for us? I suspect all of us here work with data in some way or another as part of our jobs. Maybe we don't touch it directly in development. Maybe we do it as part of a review or evaluation process, or maybe we're responsible for creating it. Just out of interest, what's the kind of makeup of people here in the room? How many here are developers? Okay, about half. How many people are like product managers or people who work in product? Okay, not many. A few. Any designers? No, just me. Okay. Okay. I just want to get a feel for kind of where we were with the level. So as a confession, I'm a designer. So this isn't going to be a technical talk, so apologies if that's disappointing. But I just wanted to talk to you about some of my experiences in building API products, really. And some of that might resonate with you and hopefully be helpful going forwards, no matter where you fall on the technical spectrum. So I'm a product/UX designer. It's one of those jobs where the job title changes every week. But right now I'm working mainly in product management and design. I've worked all over the place, including for CERN, Al Jazeera, ESPN, and Adobe, all working with large API products. Right now, I'm working for a startup called Duvu. We're funded by an incubator who is created by Jaguar Land Rover, the car manufacturer. And obviously, as a transport-focused incubator, they have a lot of interest in how data is going to transform the mobility and transport sector. I'm sure you've all heard this quote going around that a connected car is going to produce something in the region of 25 gigs of data an hour. So that's a lot of work to be done in understanding how that data gets to where it needs to be and shared with who needs it most. To do that, we're building an API marketplace specifically for the mobility sector. And we're creating a protocol that connects data providers with data consumers. And we're doing that through blockchain, specifically Ethereum smart contracts, to make sure that when data is delivered and consumed through an API, we can ensure that the provider gets rewarded and the user of the data actually gets the data that they signed up to receive. So this creates a more transparent and fair approach to API billing and usage. So you literally only pay for what you use at a very kind of granular level, which is something we couldn't really do before. And also that the SLA that you agreed to is actually bound to the transaction. So if you agreed a certain amount of uptime, that's built into the smart contract, and that has to actually be true to actually get paid. So as we started building this product, a few things became clear to us. One of which is that APIs aren't just for developers; they're actually for everyone across the kind of the spectrum of the business. And that should have probably been a bit more obvious for us, but we were very focused on doing stuff for developers initially. So we'd been a bit too focused on where and how APIs got used in production, which of course is probably developers. And we had this kind of light bulb moment when we started talking to customers, because there's many roles within a project outside of development where you need to understand an API, the constraints, the content, the costs, plus any kind of other number of details, including performance, reliability, latency, etc., etc. And as a designer and product manager, I'd kind of bumped into all these things in my career in various ways, but being sort of semi-technical and being dangerous enough to, put some stuff together, I kind of struggled through with a mixture of Stack Overflow and helping, pestering my developer friends. So I could kind of get a handle on how these things worked. But obviously that's not for everyone. So I guess the most important thing to do when looking at a product problem, and that's what we had when we started building this platform, was to kind of look at it with very fresh eyes and actually step back and challenge it with some basic questions. And we're talking really basic, like, what does it do? Why does it exist? Who's going to use it? And when you do that with APIs, the first two are pretty easy. To kind of trivialize the value of an API, it's just a bridge between the outside world, your application, either executing commands against your application, submitting data to it, pulling data from somewhere else, or asking for some data back to reuse somewhere else. Fundamentally, the stuff that gets transferred back and forth is content, which leads to the third question, I guess, which is who will use it? To some degree, that depends a lot on the type of data we're talking about. We're very focused on transport data. A lot of that's mapping. Some of it is location data. Some of it is actual telemetry from the car. But we think that can be mitigated. The complexity can be mitigated through the context of how you either kind of inspect, review, or play with an API to see whether it's a good fit for your product or service. As we saw in the last talk, the scope of data out there is just unfathomable. It's vast. So being able to actually evaluate whether an API is good for your project or product is actually essential. So I wanted to talk about a few of the problems we had when trying to make this product that was initially for developers that then became more of an all-encompassing consumer and internal kind of tooling product. So some of these problems may well affect developers and people on the front line of implementing APIs, but for the purpose of the discussion, I wanted to focus on how these problems act as a barrier, really, to more people having an understanding of how to use APIs as a tool without the need to start writing code. And that seems to be a theme that's playing out throughout the conference, actually, which in turn actually benefits everyone at every stage of the project, with more of a common understanding and a vocabulary around the way an API behaves and what that can deliver. Totally democratizes the planning and evaluation process and starts some really interesting discussions and solves problems before you've kind of wasted, valuable dev cycles. And so, yeah, we'll start by talking about some of those problems. And number one, I'm sure you've all experienced this, is terrible documentation. Documentation is such an important part of any product, especially one that runs essentially self-service. And yet it's one of the things that tends to get least attention and in turn generates massive overhead through support or questions raised to developers. Of course, good documentation takes time, but it's so essential to anyone intending to work with the API. They need to know what to expect, what it does, how they authenticate, what do individual methods, functions, endpoints do, what does a good response look like, what does a bad one look like. All these things are absolutely vital, but they get often overlooked. A lack of information. Even if executional documentation is good, there's a boatload of information associated with an API that influences how it gets used, that influences whether it's a good fit for you or whether it's safe to use. At the very minimum, you need to understand things like the legals, the terms of use, any rate limiting, uptime, versioning, roadmaps for those changes, so you can actually make good plans. I'm sure we've all experienced some kind of service outage where API has changed or has been, the version's updated without us knowing, and things are broken. On top of that, we've got technical considerations like geo concerns, how location influences latency, even things whether throttling or caching affects the timeliness of that data. these things tend to get overlooked. So the other massive barrier, which seems to be with getting APIs talked about across the business, is developers. Obviously, developers are the people who actually interface with the actual API when it gets to implementation. But earlier on in the process, one of the biggest barriers we found when discussing these issues with customers was that you need a developer to just look at an API. And although it's true when you start talking about integrations, that shouldn't necessarily be the case if all you're doing is exploring opportunities or start poking around in the type of content available in the API. And traditional approaches generally make that process more complex than it needs to be. This is kind of a more of a general point around inclusive design, I suppose. And that's language. And what we found working with APIs is the language used, the vocabulary used is super technical. And that in itself is a massive barrier. And so, yeah, language is so important when producing services that are accessible to everyone. And this happens across every field. You know, we're not entirely to blame for this. It happens everywhere. So common terms just become a colloquialism, or we get conditioned through exposure to using slang, and that actually excludes a lot of people from the process. We're all guilty of it, and sometimes we presume that everyone who's in contact with the thing has the same level of understanding, and that's not always the case. You know, even something as simple as a status code. You know, you can be in a meeting and the developer's saying, "Oh yeah, we got to 200," and that makes perfect sense to them. But I'm sitting there thinking, "What the hell's a 200? Is that good? Is a 300 better?" So yeah, it's about context and understanding, you know, the right language to use in those situations. The fifth one is format, and this is more of an output thing. So dealing with the content flowing in and out of an API, you generally end up staring a bunch of JSON in the face. And I don't know about you, but I personally don't like JSON to read and write. It's a lot less painful than XML, obviously, but at the end of the day, these languages are meant for machines, not humans. But when you're sitting there evaluating the output of an API, then JSON is not the friendliest thing. So how can we try and address some of these problems? And we do this a couple of ways, actually. And neither of these are particularly revolutionary in concept, but quite revolutionary in impact. So we do that through tooling. And use of inclusive design at all stages of the process, so that when we do design a product that that's no longer just intended to be developer facing. And it's quite interesting actually. A lot of companies struggle to build these tools for developers when actually developers are the most kind of able to fix problems, but we're actually missing out on opportunity to make this whole process a lot more democratic. So the first way to fix that is to acknowledge that documentation matters a lot. And where do we start? So good documentation is the cheapest and the fastest way to improve any API, and that's a given. Not only will it benefit developers, the business gets to benefit too, through cost savings, through lack of support calls, just generally smoother running businesses. If you think about large-scale data projects where teams are fluid and developers move in and out of projects, the better something's well documented, the overhead of like handover and all that kind of stuff makes things a lot less painful and helps keep services alive, which is actually the most important thing. And of course, secondarily to that, the more descriptive and human-focused documentation is, it means that people other than developers can also benefit. More info. Information around APIs tends to be very functional, and dare I say it's sparse. And by that I mean I can go to a project's documentation pages and I see stuff like, here's a list of methods, here's a list of functions, list of endpoints, and I can perhaps click around and see what a response looks like. But what I don't see is some of the information that we need in the context of myself as a product owner. I need to know whether this particular service is going to fit with my product. So what I'd like to see is more kind of expressive and specific metrics on things like latency, and geo-based influences that comes with that. Uptime over specific ranges of time. Traffic volume, and if that's going to affect my product. And this last one's a bit weird, but we work with some really massive data sets in transport. And the size of the request is actually super important because we were testing some stuff and we hit an endpoint. And the request was so large, it actually came back and crashed Chrome because it took so long to reply. That information is useful up front. Firm believer in the power of an interface. We saw some really cool stuff from the last speaker with kind of drag and drop interfaces and stuff. When I was working at Adobe, I worked on large-scale kind of design tooling to help people build websites without knowing code, and we're applying that same kind of philosophy to API tooling. There's something really empowering about obfuscating the complexity and making something really technical open to anyone. And we're seeing a bit of that now with kind of Swagger UI and things like that. But we think there's we can go further. Slight bit of overlap there with the content thing about documentation, but clarity is super important. Not more or better documentation, just clearer documentation. So an example of that is, this is Swagger UI interface. You probably have seen this demo 1,000 times. What we have here is a very generic example, but we have the label here where you have add a new pet to the store as the descriptor. And then when you get into the function, you've got this thing about adding an object. Now, to a developer, that makes perfect sense, but anyone across the business might struggle with that. How does that relate to the actual thing? Are they talking about like a pet brush, or some kind of thing that's actually an object? By simplifying the language, we can make things a lot more accessible. Doing the same stuff. So this is about looking at how we actually return the data from an API. Obviously, staring at a big bunch of JSON isn't much fun for anyone. So one of the ways we do that is we build interfaces to help people do that. And this is an example of a prototype we built, or I built a while back for the UK Census, which is a government project. And on the right-hand side, you've got all the JSON spat out, which is a schema builder. The left-hand side is just a very simple interface. So everyone in the business was able to use this, everyone from kind of like researchers, analysts, methodologists, nobody with technical skills, actually. And what this did was actually save an enormous amount of time, made the whole process a lot more open, and actually brought the business together and solved a bunch of problems. Again, not revolutionary, but simple tricks that we often get overlooked. So that might give you a bit of insight in some of the problems that we've solved, I hope, with our product. We're in private alpha at the moment. Public beta goes out early next year. We're also in the process of an initial coin offering. We're in the process of raising funds to go build this thing. So check out the website, have a look. If you've got any questions, give us a shout after. And that's it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Alex.